There is probably no food more closely associated with America than the hamburger. You see it at backyard cookouts, diners, roadside restaurants, stadiums, and fast food counters across the country. But here's the strange part. The hamburger's name points to a German city. So how did a food associated with Hamburg become one of the strongest symbols of American food? And perhaps even more interesting, who actually invented the hamburger? The answer isn't a single person. It's a story of immigration, technology, American fairs, cheap food, and one simple idea that changed everything. Let's get into it. The hamburger didn't suddenly appear one morning. Its story began with something much simpler: ground or chopped meat. Long before the modern hamburger, cooks in Europe were already preparing minced or chopped meat in different forms. One important ancestor was known as Hamburg steak, a preparation associated with German-American food culture. But here's where the story gets complicated. The hamburger did not simply travel in a straight line from Hamburg, Germany, directly to America. Historians have found earlier European recipes for chopped or minced meat, and the exact relationship between those dishes and the modern hamburger remains debated. What we do know is that by the 19th century, Hamburg steak had become part of American cooking. It was usually served on a plate, meat, seasoning, perhaps onions or gravy. It looked much more like a steak dish than the hamburger we know today. And then America changed it. By the late 1800s, something incredibly important was happening in American kitchens. Mechanical meat grinders were becoming more common. In 1897, the Landers, Frary & Clark Company introduced its universal food chopper. And products like this helped make grinding meat much easier for ordinary American households. That might sound like a small invention. It wasn't. Once meat could be ground quickly and cheaply, cooks and food vendors could turn inexpensive cuts into something completely different. They could season it, shape it, flatten it, and cook it quickly. The hamburger was beginning to take shape, but there was still one missing ingredient: bread. And this is where the famous hamburger mystery begins. At least several Americans later claimed they had invented the hamburger sandwich. One story points to Charlie Nagreen, who supposedly flattened meatballs at a Wisconsin fair so customers could eat them while walking. Another points to the Menches brothers, who were said to have served a beef sandwich at a fair in Hamburg, New York. Then there's Louis Lassen in New Haven, Connecticut, whose restaurant tradition says he served ground beef scraps between bread to a customer who needed something quick to eat. The problem? These stories were recorded and promoted at different times, and historians can't prove that any one of these people was definitively the first. That's why there is no universally accepted inventor of the hamburger. And honestly, that may be the most American part of the story. The hamburger seems to have emerged through several people, in several places, around roughly the same period, especially at fairs, festivals, lunch counters, and other places where people wanted something cheap, portable, and fast. The hamburger didn't need a single inventor. It needed the right moment, and America was ready for it. Cities were growing. Factories were expanding. Workers had limited time for lunch. Fairs attracted enormous crowds. People were increasingly eating on the move. A hamburger solved the problem beautifully. Take inexpensive ground beef, shape it into a patty, cook it quickly, put it between bread, and hand it to someone who can eat it without a knife and fork. It was simple, portable, affordable, and extremely easy to reproduce. But there was still one major problem. Americans didn't necessarily trust ground beef. In the early 20th century, concerns about the meatpacking industry were growing. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, brought public attention to unsanitary conditions in Chicago's meatpacking industry. Ground beef already had an image problem because consumers couldn't easily see what had gone into it. So, how could someone convince Americans that a hamburger was safe? Enter White Castle. In 1921, Billy Ingram and cook Walter Anderson opened White Castle in Wichita, Kansas. They understood that selling hamburgers wasn't just about the meat. It was about trust. White Castle used a distinctive white architectural style and emphasized cleanliness and consistency. Customers could see the food being prepared. The burgers were small, standardized, inexpensive, and produced in a highly organized kitchen. White Castle became the first major restaurant chain devoted to mass-producing hamburgers, and suddenly, the hamburger wasn't just something you bought from a fairground vendor, it was becoming a standardized American restaurant meal. Then came the next transformation, the automobile. As Americans increasingly traveled by car, roadside restaurants and drive-ins expanded. The hamburger was almost perfectly designed for this new America. It was quick, it could be wrapped, it could be eaten without a knife and fork, and restaurants could produce large numbers of them quickly. By the 1940s, the hamburger had become a quintessential American meal. Later, restaurant chains would take that idea much further. And yes, the McDonald brothers played an important role in turning hamburger production into an assembly line-style system. But that is another story, and one we've already covered. The bigger story here is what happened to the hamburger itself. It escaped the diner, it escaped the fairground, it escaped the South and the Midwest, and eventually, it went everywhere. Today, the hamburger isn't just American food, it's global food. Countries around the world have created their own versions using local ingredients, flavors, sauces, and cooking traditions. But the basic formula remains recognizable: a patty, a bun, and endless possibilities in between. And there's an interesting twist to the story. The hamburger has even become an economic measuring tool. The Economist's Big Mac Index uses the price of a McDonald's Big Mac in different countries as a simple way to compare currencies and purchasing power. Think about how far this food has traveled. Something that began as a collection of older meat traditions became a cheap American sandwich and eventually became a symbol of globalization itself. So, who invented the hamburger? Maybe that's the wrong question, because there probably wasn't one inventor. There was no single kitchen where someone suddenly created the food Americans know today. Instead, the hamburger evolved. Ground meat became easier to produce. Hamburg steak became part of American cooking. Food vendors discovered that patties could be served between bread. Fairs made the idea popular. Restaurants standardized it, and the automobile helped carry it across the country. Then, American businesses turned it into an industry, and eventually, the rest of the world adopted it. So the next time you pick up a hamburger, remember that you're holding more than a piece of fast food. You're holding the result of centuries of culinary evolution, immigration, technology, American entrepreneurship, and cultural change. It doesn't really matter who put the first patty between two pieces of bread. What matters is what America did with the idea. America didn't invent every part of the hamburger, but America turned it into an icon. And that's the secret history of the hamburger.